I climbed down into a dry well, looking for shelter. A widow said, "They're draining this farm by Friday." Deacon Whitfield had $10, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools he'd carried since his last steady job on an irrigation maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any old well he passed for shelter from a storm. A habit that had led him, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept him dry for a few hours at a stretch. He was 22 years old, laid off 8 months earlier, when the regional water authority that employed him privatized its irrigation maintenance division, eliminating every position the new contractor considered redundant. He had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work he could find. The privatization notice had cited operational modernization as its justification, language Deacon had come to recognize, across 8 months of towns exactly like this one, as the specific corporate dialect for deciding that a technician's actual familiarity with a region's water systems mattered less than whatever a private contractor's centralized approach could theoretically manage instead. He had grown up around irrigation systems his whole life, his father having maintained water infrastructure for nearly 3 decades before him, and he had learned, riding along on his father's service calls from an early age, the particular gravity of water rights disputes in farm country, where a family's entire livelihood could turn on a single decades-old document. He found the dry well on a stormy evening in early autumn, its stone-lined shaft long since abandoned once the farm switched to a modern pump system. Its wooden cover rotted enough that Deacon lifted it aside easily and climbed down the old iron rungs set into the shaft's wall, grateful for shelter from a downpour that had soaked him through within minutes of the sky opening. Thunder rolled somewhere close overhead as he descended, and he found himself grateful for the well's stone walls, which muffled the worst of the storm's noise into something considerably more bearable. He reached the well's dry bottom, to find a woman already there, sitting on an overturned bucket with a lantern and a stack of papers spread across her knees, her expression shifting from startled to simply exhausted. Once she registered he meant no threat, the lantern light caught deep circles beneath her eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who had slept poorly for several nights running. "You've picked a strange place to shelter," she said, "though I suppose I can hardly claim better judgment myself, sitting down here reviewing paperwork by lantern light instead of doing it properly at my own kitchen table. I saw the storm coming and needed somewhere dry," Deacon said. "I didn't expect to find company. I'm sorry to intrude." "You're not intruding on anything worth protecting," the woman said. "Name's Naomi Winters. This well's been dry for years, same as most of my patients these past few days. I've been coming down here simply to think without my own phone ringing every 20 minutes. She looked at the papers in her lap, with an expression Deacon recognized immediately as genuine dread. "They're draining this farm by Friday, 4 days from now, and I don't have anything close to what I need to stop it." Over the following hour, sheltering together in the well's dry stone chamber, while rain continued hammering the ground above them, Naomi told Deacon exactly what was bearing down on her farm, with considerably less patience than the storm outside. Her husband, Silas, had held senior water rights to the reservoir, feeding their farm's irrigation system for over 30 years, rights established decades before their neighbor Wendell Sorrell ever purchased the adjoining property. Silas's death 8 months earlier had apparently emboldened Wendell to finally challenge those rights formally, filing a claim with the Water District arguing his own historical use predated Silas's documented rights, a claim the district had provisionally accepted pending a final hearing, issuing a temporary order requiring the shared reservoir to be drained and redirected to Wendell's property by Friday, while the matter worked through the courts. Wendell and Silas never much liked each other, even in the best years, Naomi said. Some old dispute about a fence line, decades before I ever married into this family. I don't think Wendell's motivated purely by water. I think losing Silas gave him an opening he'd been waiting for considerably longer than 8 months, and he's not about to let sentiment slow him down now that the opportunity's actually arrived. How does a temporary order get issued without requiring documentation from both sides first? Deacon asked. The judge said the balance of harm favored a temporary redirection while the matter was properly reviewed, since Wendell's own crops were reportedly suffering without it. Naomi said, I argued my own crops would suffer considerably more, losing water we've relied on for 30 years, but apparently that argument required documentation I couldn't immediately produce, while Wendell's attorney had his paperwork organized and ready. I have spent every spare hour since searching through Silas's files, and I keep coming up empty on the one document that would actually settle this outright. What exactly are you looking for? Deacon asked. The original decree establishing Silas's priority date, Naomi said. I know it exists. I remember him showing it to me once, years ago, explaining why it mattered. I simply cannot for the life of me remember where he kept it, and every filing cabinet in that farmhouse office seems to hold nothing but ordinary invoices and receipts. Deacon spent the following hours doing the only thing he knew how to do with what little he had. He helped Naomi search through Silas's remaining papers, understanding that 4 days left considerably less room for a careful, unhurried search than the situation actually deserved. They worked through the farmhouse office late into that first night once the storm passed, and again the following morning, Naomi growing increasingly discouraged with each drawer and folder that failed to produce the one document she needed most. I've looked through this office a dozen times these past few days, she admitted, rubbing her eyes after another fruitless hour. I'm starting to fear Silas simply lost it himself, years ago, and never thought to mention it because the dispute with Wendell hadn't yet resurfaced to make it matter. Would he have kept it somewhere less obvious than his ordinary filing system? Deacon asked. Some men separate their most important documents from their routine paperwork, specifically so they don't get lost among invoices and receipts. Silas wasn't a particularly organized man, if I'm honest, Naomi said. I don't think he had any elaborate system beyond simply filing things as they arrived in whatever folder happened to be handy at the time. It was in a metal filing cabinet in the farmhouse office, in a folder mislabeled with an unrelated equipment invoice, apparently by simple accident decades earlier, that Deacon finally found the original water rights decree, dated a full 11 years before Wendell Sorrell's own family had purchased the adjoining property, establishing beyond any reasonable dispute that Silas's rights held clear priority over anything Wendell could possibly claim. This settles it entirely, Deacon said, reading the decree twice to be certain of its date against the property records Naomi had already gathered. Wendell's claim can't possibly predate this, given his family didn't even own the adjoining land until over a decade after this decree was issued. Naomi read the document herself, her hands trembling with a relief that seemed almost too large to fully process, after days of mounting dread. I don't understand how this ended up filed under an equipment invoice, she said. Silas was meticulous about nearly everything. I can't imagine him misfiling something this significant. Papers get misplaced during a difficult season, regardless of how careful a person usually is, Deacon said. I don't think the filing error changes anything about what this document actually proves. They drove to the Water District's office the following morning, filing an emergency motion with the decree attached, and the district's own attorney, once he reviewed the document, confirmed within the hour that the temporary drainage order would need to be immediately vacated pending full reconsideration, since the priority date established by Silas's decree left no reasonable basis for the original ruling to stand. The attorney, a methodical man named Grant Ferris, who reviewed the decree twice against the district's own historical records before offering any opinion, seemed genuinely relieved to find a resolution this clean available to him. This should have been the very first document either side produced, Ferris said. I don't fault your husband's estate for a filing error, Mrs. Winters, but I do think this case illustrates exactly why the district ought to maintain its own duplicate copies of these decrees, rather than relying entirely on private parties to keep track of documents this consequential. Can the order actually be vacated before Friday? Naomi asked, her voice tight with the particular hope of someone afraid to fully believe good news until it was formally confirmed. I intend to file the vacation request myself this afternoon, Ferris said. I don't see any reason for this to wait even a single additional day, given how clearly this decree settles the priority question. I've never seen a case turn this completely on a single misfiled document, the district attorney told them, reviewing the decree's official seal with evident relief himself, as though he'd been uncomfortable with the original ruling all along. I'll have the order vacated by end of day. Mr. Sorrell's attorney will need to substantially revise their approach once they understand the priority question is now settled, rather than genuinely contested. The drainage order was formally vacated that same afternoon, well ahead of Friday's deadline, and Naomi received a written confirmation that the reservoir would remain fully intact, with Wendell Sorrell's underlying claim now facing a considerably steeper challenge given the decree's unambiguous priority date. I don't know how to thank you for finding this in time, Naomi told Deacon once the order's vacation was confirmed. 4 more days, and this farm would have lost 30 years of water rights over a filing error that was never anyone's fault beyond simple bad luck. I think Silas's own careful work protected you regardless of the filing mistake, Deacon said. It simply took somebody willing to look past the label on a folder to find what was actually inside it. Deacon stayed on at the farm through that winter and the ones that followed, helping Naomi manage the property's irrigation needs while the underlying water rights dispute worked its way through a considerably more measured court process than the panic of that first Friday deadline had ever allowed for. Wendell Sorrell's claim, once formally reviewed against the decree's clear priority date, was ultimately dismissed entirely the following spring, the presiding judge noting in his written ruling that the 11-year gap between the decree's issuance and Wendell's own family's purchase of the adjoining property left no reasonable legal basis for the challenge to proceed any further. Deacon spent that first year restoring the reservoir's own aging intake system, work that had been neglected during the months Naomi had spent consumed by the legal dispute rather than ordinary farm maintenance, and found himself, gradually, filling the particular gap left by Silas's death in a way that felt less like replacing him and more like simply making certain the water kept flowing exactly the way Silas himself had always intended it to. Silas would have been glad to know his own paperwork finally protected what he spent 30 years building, Naomi told Deacon one evening, the two of them sitting together on the farmhouse porch watching rain fall steadily on crops that would, this season at least, have all the water they actually needed. He always said the most important documents in a person's life were rarely the ones anyone thought to look for first. I think he'd have been glad about more than just the decree, Deacon said. I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to face those 4 days entirely alone, whatever the eventual outcome turned out to be. Deacon wrote to his own father that winter, describing the well and the water rights dispute and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine search for storm shelter to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose he'd feared he might never find again after the privatization ended his own irrigation career. His father's reply came a few weeks later, brief but warm in the particular way Deacon remembered him always being. Told you a good irrigation man's instinct for finding shelter in exactly the right well would eventually lead somewhere worth staying. Proud of you for finding both the work and the person who needed you to find it, right when the clock was running out on her. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many rights and protections, carefully established decades ago, sit vulnerable simply because the proof of them gets misplaced during exactly the season a family can least afford to lose track of anything? And what does it take? A stranger climbing down into a dry well for shelter, a decree filed under the wrong label, a district attorney willing to review the evidence properly before a deadline runs out. For 30 years of water rights to finally be protected before Friday arrives. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.